names is really gratifying, and so thank you. It did occur to me today that you might want to know a bit about Billy's family, and that his sister, we mentioned his sister died about a month ago, and it's his last sibling. She was 92, and she was in great health to the end. And unlike Billy, she was very introverted. You know, he was the essence of an extrovert. She was introverted, but like him, she had a lightning wit. And Kathy and I grew to know her and her husband very well, and she was so funny and very self-critical about herself and her brother and her whole family. Devoutly evangelical. She was not, shall we just say this, she was not at all in the political line of her nephew Franklin. I don't know how she voted exactly, but she just wasn't there, that's for sure. Strong supporter of world vision, this form of evangelicalism. Anyway, wonderful woman, Jean Granville. And the other siblings died, actually, there are 3 other siblings, and they died quite a long time ago. Another sister and his brother, who was a farmer, a prosperous millionaire farmer. You don't often think of farmers, doing very well, but he did very, very well. 5 kids, they're all alive, and one lives in Seattle, and has lived all his life in Seattle. Ned, I've never met him, and I have been told that he would not be willing to meet me or any other historian or journalist. He lives in Seattle for a reason. He just does not want to be connected with all this. And it's not that he's, left the fold theologically. He's involved actually in shipping Bibles to China. But he's started his own life. You gotta respect that person, because they live under a tremendous glare of publicity all the time. And his name is Ned. And the oldest is Anne, and lives in Raleigh. I've never met her. I don't think she's interested in history, and so I haven't tried that. But she just lives over in Raleigh, and has several kids. And her husband was a basketball player.
Wonderful.
Oh yeah.
Speak.
On the 1956 championship team.
Oh, what was his name?
It's a unusual name, and I can't remember.
Lots.
Well, Lotz was his last
Oh,
name.
it was
but-
Lots. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
Lots
thinking
is-
about somebody else.
Dan-
Danny Lots.
Yeah.
He was a
Yeah.
dentist
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
He was a dentist.
Yeah.
Dennis and basketball player before that. Yeah. Okay.
Have you ever heard Anne speak?
No.
Oh, she's wonderful.
She is really good.
She is
wonderful.
Yeah.
She has mannerisms like her father.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I hear. Yeah. And then Gigi is the next one, and she lives in Montreat.
Mhm.
And then the next one is Ruth, and known as Bunny, and she lives somewhere in Northern Virginia. And they both have had lives as authors. And then a Franklin. Don't need to go there too much. I will say that I'll just be honest. I'm not a partisan of Franklin's politics, and Franklin tried to thwart the publication of my book. So I have that problem with Franklin. He has a problem with me. But I admire Samaritan's Purse. And Kathy, participated in, Operation Christmas Child, and, how they're on the ground. I mean, and right there, and then the first ones usually. And so you just have to admire that. I think it's right up with World Vision. So anyway, those are the kids. He had 37 grandchildren. And they range in politics. I don't know about theology. They range in politics. And I know some are very conservative, and some are very clear that they do not endorse their Uncle Franklin. And they've been quite public about it. So there's quite a range. So then Kathy asked Mr. Graham how many great-grandchildren he had. And he said, I have no idea. He said, they come and they just come off the bus. They keep coming. He said, I just had no idea. So anyway, that's the family. And I would say, I just have to give credit. David Bruce is the number 2 person there, and a wonderful man. He is Baptist, He's not Methodist, and I've been working on that for some time, hasn't worked. He's very conservative and yet just as ironic and just, I worked with someone once from NPR who worked with David Bruce, and she said, he's the sweetest Baptist I've ever met. How many Baptists do you know? I mean, I'd say, geez, but he's wonderful. I have to give him credit. Well, what I want to do tonight is talk, and I'll try to be concise because this is a topic that could go on forever, but talk about Mr. Graham's legacy. And I might repeat a few things I've said, but I'll try not to. Stick your hand up if I'm boring you. And what I'll do is focus on his legacy within the evangelical tradition. Neil and I have been talking about what is evangelicalism, and let's just not try real hard to get that defined now. Let's just say, it's a kind of faith subculture that, affects and influences at least half of American Protestants, the other half being broadly mainline or liberal. But this church is Wesleyan / evangelical. Our church in Chapel Hill was. I wouldn't say most Methodists, but especially in the South, most Methodist churches are mainline evangelical. And magazines like Christianity Today, which really founded, certainly as a voice of evangelicalism. So it's, without spending a lot of time talking, just think of moderately conservative Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and then a lot of parachurch organizations like World Vision, Youth for Christ, these organizations, Compassion International. There's a huge, infrastructure out there of organizations that are evangelical, but they're not denominational. Billy had a great deal to do with the shaping of modern evangelicalism. And reporters will tell you that there are about 80 million, 100 million self-assessed evangelicals today. It's gotten very difficult because of Trump. And I would just have to say, you just got to set that aside. And say that's just a whole other can of worms. I mean, you just think of it as a faith tradition, a religious tradition, which I think is not nearly as committed to Trump as the press would have us believe. It's still, we're looking at 80 million or something, a lot of folks. Billy had a lot to do with shaping what that is. And I want to break it down in terms of belief, and then culture, and then politics. Rick was here a couple of weeks ago, and he asked me about politics, and he's not here tonight, but I'll get to that. When we talk about Billy and belief, we have to say there are some things that he never changed on, he never budged. And I would call that the evangelical core. These are beliefs that I have, most Methodists have, and in a way it's boilerplate. It's just, things that we think that the absolute number one. There's several. I mean, God's sovereignty, the God who reigns, the authority of the Bible, rather than say the Reader's Digest. Sin is a reality. Christ's saving death, resurrection, return, that's all part. The return, exactly how that is, that evangelicals vary a whole lot on how they understand that, but Christ's death and resurrection is fundamental to our faith, is core. Moral growth, you can't be a true Christian and just say, well, I'm just not gonna grow in grace, I mean, that may happen that we don't grow in grace, and sometimes we regress, but you just can't say that's irrelevant. I mean, it's fundamental. Mission to others, whether it's defined as food bank or overseas missions. And I think evangelicals are very distinctive because of their sense, and this is something you'll never find in a statement of faith, but I would put it there, is that doctrine matters. What we do on Sundays matters. It's just not something that's irrelevant, like say golfing or something like, well, some days they golf. It's not. It matters what we do and how we live our lives. These are all things that Graham did not touch, and in fact, he further in popular culture and in his own mind. What are some of the things he did touch? And here I would say that I'm totally prepared to defend everything I say by looking at the things that he said, especially to reporters where it's unvarnished. You know, nobody's going to get in there and change it. And so if you look at his views, what he actually said, he did make some significant changes to the evangelical tradition. A lot of people resist that, say, oh, no, he didn't. Well, he did. He actually did, I promise you. First thing he did is that he changed the notion of biblical inerrancy, I'll explain that, to biblical infallibility. And that is, evangelicals, especially fundamentalists, had held for centuries that the Bible makes no mistakes in any form. Biblical, scientific, historical, scientific, everything is exactly the way it is. And fortunately, in Neil's class, we've been dealing with Genesis, and I don't think anybody's hung up on that in that class. But there are an awful lot of fundamentalists who are, 6-day crew, the literal snake and all that. Billy had no use for that. And he would say, well, he said, I think it's fundamentally historically accurate, scientifically accurate. But he said, that's not the point. He said, the point is that the Bible, this is the key word, infallibly does what it promises to do. And that is to bring us to faith in Christ. And I think that's very powerful. And he'd say, don't get hung up on the 6-day creation. That's just not what it's about. What the Bible is about is how do we find faith in Christ, faith that we live with day by day. And, and that's what the Bible is about. And another way he put that sometime is he said, I love this. He said, the Bible holds authority because it works. He said because it's true in some, nitpicking sense, because it works. It changes our lives. The second way that he changed evangelical belief is the way evangelicals define conversion. An awful lot of them, then as now, say, well, conversion is, is a one-time deal. You walk forward, you sign a card. Before then, you weren't converted, then you are, and then you're all good to go. And yeah, there were a lot. A lot of people had overnight changes. They call them sky blue conversions. People were dramatically changed. And the story of Louis Zamperini is a good example. And it was the movie Unbroken, and or a Hillenbrand book about Louis Zamperini, the war hero. And his was pretty much an overnight conversion. His wife forced him to go, and he listened to that message. Things are going to change. So there are people, millions probably, who underwent that. But Billy understood that not everybody did. And number one, his wife Ruth did not ever have a conversion. She said, I grew up thinking of myself as a Christian and never thought of myself otherwise. That's pretty powerful stuff, there wasn't ever a point in my life, and he understood that. There'd be a lot of people like that. What he also understood is that a great many, my guess is a majority of people who came forward in the meetings were not converting from nothing, but rather they were reaffirming former commitments. And Kathy and I read so many of those letters, and I would say a large minority of them, maybe majority, would run like this. I grew up a Christian. I grew up in a local Baptist church. I was a GA. I went to youth group. Then I went in the Army. And I got in with a bunch of guys and started doing stuff that I shouldn't. And then I came back and I was doing stuff that I shouldn't. And then, and had some relationships with my secretary, which I shouldn't. And then I came to town. And I found out that that's not the way I need to live. And I've come back to the faith. I've come back. And the coming back It's just so important to how people related to him. The third change when I think that, and there's one thing I want to talk about Billy, is that Billy was very intentional about saying that when we are converted, come to faith in Christ, some, especially Baptists, will say being saved, Pentecostals are like, I got saved, okay. Well, saved from the life of sin, okay. He was very intentional about saying that's the heart of the gospel, personal transformation, but it can't end there. It's got to have some manifestation with, called the social gospel. Food pantry, working with racial reconciliation, working with, giving your life, your money, your time, to countless ways that people need to see us as Christian exemplifying our faith. So Billy was very clear about this, that you can't just be converted, come to faith in Christ and just sit on that. You gotta do something, one way or another. Prison ministry, Samaritan's Purse, you need to do something. All right, that's one big topic, is how Billy shaped evangelical belief. Second big topic is how he shaped evangelical culture. And that's a little harder to pin this down, but I once knew a historian at my field taught University of Florida, and a wonderful historian who's now gone, Sam Hill. And I think Sam captured it in a sentence. And that is, he said, Billy taught evangelicals when to wear a necktie. Captured it. And, if there was a time when, there was a time when they weren't wearing neckties and they were laboring people, men and women. And so that was part of it, but it was also partly just not understanding the protocols of mainstream culture. And there are various ways of getting at this, is that you can also say, and here I crib this from another historian, and it's true, is that he taught evangelicals how to sit at the public table of discussion, or you can change the word public somewhere else, at the table of public discussion. He taught evangelicals how to enter into dialogue with others instead of being in a bubble, you're right, you're wrong, not going to college. I mean, he taught them that it's important to engage the culture, to have something to say to the culture, something constructive to say. And I'll get off track a little bit here and say he wanted nothing to do with what we today call cultural wars. As cultural wars began to solidify in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and again, warriors of the cultural wars, including his son, would call him to join the cultural wars. And he'd say, no, that's just not what we do. That is not what the Lord wants us to do. Those are other fights you can have other days if you want to. But as Christians, as evangelicals, as Methodists, as Baptists, as believing, practicing Christians, what we need to do is be able to engage the culture profitably. And if people disagree with us, then say, come on, let's sit down, let's talk about it. And let's understand each other and see if we can work this out. And as the years went on, he was more and more, one of his lines is over and over, he said, it never hurts to talk. And especially when he went overseas. And he would come in and interact with Hindus, with Buddhists, people of other religions, no religions, atheists. He talked to anyone. He said, it never hurts to talk. Let's just sit down, let's chew the fat about this issue and see if we can come to at least a working arrangement. So I would say one of the key things he did with evangelical culture is teach them how to wear a necktie, teach them how to sit down at the public table and engage a conversation. So I've seen one place where he was especially good with conversation with Jews. And this is what was so tragic about this incident where he got into this disparaging Jew with Richard Nixon, and it was radically atypical. I mean, it's just so hard to kind of, as I told you, I think the issue there is this obsequiousness to Nixon. And he made a point over his life of saying, you need to work with Jews. At one point, he even distanced himself to Christian missions to Jews, and he said, God's covenant with Jews is everlasting. And at the very least, we should focus on our missions on people who have no faith and not practicing Jews. So anyway, how to deal with other people. A second thing he did with evangelicals and culture is that I think he defined the center. It was a kind of centrist appeal. And if you follow Billy, you're not really going to be defined as someone who's on a fringe. It's someone who is pretty much trying to shoot down the middle of a historic Christian tradition. What is the center? One wonderful historian named George Marsden, had a great line here. He said, an evangelical can be defined as anybody who really likes Billy Graham. Okay, that's a great way of saying it. And part of defining the center is a sense of scale. He understood that Christ did not come to earth to deliver people from smoking cigarettes. Addictions are a bad thing. We knew that. That's not the point. The point is Christ came to earth to change our lives, to give us a new way of seeing life and a new mission with each other. Some people have a problem with cigarettes or, gambling or, all kinds of things that we have addictions for. Just being human almost to have addictions. And he understood that there's a sense of scale, and there are some things that are a whole lot more important than others. And then lastly, I would say he established a sense of decency. And I talked about that last week, and I won't go over it again. But he defined Americans' best selves. What would that entail? Marital fidelity, financial integrity, not criticizing, an effort to be ironic, to be totally honest about who we are and what we do. These kinds of rules, and they're just basic, you just don't have to have some, a lot, don't have to think a lot about this is, some deep, profound things. They're just pretty basic things about decency, how to be a decent human being, a decent Christian. And I think Billy helped with that. Okay, so we talk about belief and culture. Third, I want to talk about politics. And here we can be very careful. Billy changed over the course of his life. One of the reasons I like him is that he's a man in change. He's not afraid to change, not afraid to say that he changed. What's even more interesting about him is that it was not a linear change. It wasn't like he started off at one place and just, moved along some trajectory and ended up someplace else. There was zigzagging. And, that's true of a lot of us. We zigzag according to our life experiences. And in general, there's some, minor zigzags along the way, but in general, I'll say this. He started off, and I'll explain this, politically very conservative. Through the 50s, he gradually moved into what today we call a more progressive position about politics. He wouldn't have said that. He would have said a more Christ-like, but okay, we call more progressive. And by the 60s, he started reassessing the reasons I'll talk about, and he moved backward. Now, he wouldn't say backwards. He said, I moved into a more traditional Christian position. I moved into a true Christian position. I think most of us would say he moved at least backward. And I know that's a value judgment. I don't want to suggest that being traditional is backwards. I'm just trying to, in some way, visualize this. Very conservative, gradually more liberal, moving back to a more conservative position in the sixties, and then in the seventies, moving back into a liberal position, in some ways very liberal. Okay, now let me talk about that. The most obvious question is with civil rights and race. And here's the question that always comes out, when I go out and talk, is the first question, out of the box, okay? And actually, usually the first question out of the box is, what do you think of Franklin Graham? Okay, and I try to dispatch that in about 30 seconds. Franklin, who? I've never heard. And, that handles that very quickly. I think maybe a second question often comes is, what about Billy and Martin Luther King? Were they friends? Did they get along, and all that? And that's a good test case. I would say they were publicly friendly, privately not. Okay, and I'll talk about that later. But what about Billy Graham and civil rights, or the relation of, say, white and black, broadly defined? Excuse me a second. In the 1940s, he grew up in the Deep South, and he would say that when he went to college, Wheaton College in Chicago, was the first time he ever met a black person who was a peer. There were a lot of blacks who worked on the farm, and Hispanics, Latinos, but they were not peers. They were people who worked for you, and you called them by their first names. They called you by your last name. His sister told me, she amplified this, and Jean said this with great regret herself. She said they had a black maid, and the maid went with them to church as many years as she could remember, and the black maid sat on the balcony. She said, and now then Jean would say it, and she never thought twice about, well, did you ever ask her? And Jean said, well, yeah, there's a point there. I'm pretty sure she did think about it, but I don't know about the maid. But anyway, she did sit in the balcony routinely, and they would talk about, what a wonderful cook she was, and wonderful how, everybody loved her, but she sat in the balcony. That's the South. That's not the Graham family. That's one of a million families. We didn't have a black maid, but if we had, that's the family. That would have been my family, okay? We didn't have any maid, but I'm saying if we had, that would have been the situation. That's what Billy grew up in. And through about 1950, that's pretty much where he was. Astonished that there was a black at Wheaton, and later on he said, I tried to make friends, this person, this is so interesting, 1945, trying to make friends. As late as 1950, we have him on record saying that there's a reason for segregation, and that God put blacks in Africa and put whites in America. And that's just the way God ordained it. That'd be through 1950. In the early 50s, he began dramatically to change, and a variety of reasons, but by 1952, he went to the Southern Baptist Convention, and he was a keynote speaker, and he said, our record of race relations is despicable. And he said, we've got to change, and we've got to start making apologies for the way we have been. That was in 1950. That's a dramatic change in just 2 years, but he's beginning to make a significant turnaround. In 52, 53, somewhere in there, he started to integrate his crusades. By integrate, mean that black people were welcome and they could sit anywhere they wanted. Now, until then, they could come, but again, like the maid, they could be seated elsewhere. And what's really painful is that one of his associates told me, very elderly man told me, he said, the truth is, he said, when we would have outdoor meetings, in tents, the blacks would be seated outside the tent in the sun. The whites would be in the shade inside the tent. That was the case through about 1950. And they changed that. And he said, no, that is not going to happen anymore. And he said, I'm just not going to hold a crusade unless we change that. Now, there's some mythology that gets mixed up in that he went and he pulled down the ropes and separated the ropes. I don't think he ever did that. But what he did do is insist that they integrate. And then again, Jean, sister, told me that by 53, she can well remember that blacks and whites were integrated. She said they still tended to sit with each other. Racial groups were more comfortable with each other, but not always, and it wasn't prescribed. So he's changing on that. His big crusade in New York in 57, at one point, he said, I'm looking out on that crusade and everybody out there at Madison Square Garden, he said, there are 18,000 people out there and they all look like me. We gotta change this. And so he undertook very self-consciously to begin to integrate. He brought in a black associate, a man named Howard Jones. And Howard Jones said, he said, well, if you integrate the crusades, he said, blacks are, well, of course, those names, he said Negroes. He said Negroes, said blacks. They're not going to come to the white-only crusade in Madison Square Garden. You got to take your crusade to them. And I said, yeah, you get that right. And so then they started having meetings in Harlem and black section of Brooklyn. He invited Martin Luther King to come and to give a prayer. It was a pretty still, King did, to his credit, it was a fairly stilted prayer, and Billy's response to the prayer was fairly stilted too, but at least he did it. Billy got a ton of criticism and some death threats, and so did Martin Luther King. It worked both ways. And so they both then did something very brave that night. It was on July 17, 1957. They did something very brave, and it was symbolic. And through the 50s, Billy continued to insist on the integration of his crusades and of his organization, right? Then Black Power comes along in the 60s. And there are riots in the streets, unrest, depending what term you want to use, Watts, and Billy then moves backwards. And I don't think it was because he suddenly decided, I don't like black people, because he had some very strong black supporters. E.B. Hill, for example, was the pastor of the largest black church in America, in Los Angeles. And E.B. Hill was one of Billy's close friends. And they hung out together, they rode in choppers together. So it wasn't a personal thing. They drew back. And the heart of it was, he said, change only comes through orderly process. And these agitators are going to do more damage than good. So he moves back. By the 70s, he's come to reassess all this with his reassessment of other things I'll get to in a second. And he begins to move back again. And by the 1980s, he is in Moscow and in the Patriarchal Cathedral in the heart of Moscow. He said, I've gone through 3 conversions in my life. The first is conversion to Christ. The second is conversion to the absolute necessity of racial justice. And he said those in the same sentence, same paragraph. And the third is the necessity of nuclear disarmament. Now I'm going to come to that in a second. So it's pretty amazing that he went to civil rights in the same paragraph with conversion to Christ that he did. There are a lot of other social things. He strongly supported Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. I can go into that, just saying in general, he supported the government effort to change living conditions, the poor, and that's a product of the late 60s and 70s. Where he makes a real change, though, is in the matter of nuclear war. And I intimated that when Rick asked. The organization will never be explicit about this, but I have some inside sources You get a lot of information this way, historian. Inside sources tell me that Henry Kissinger came to Montreat to Billy's home. Remember, Henry Kissinger was a secular Jew. They became friends, Billy and Henry. And Henry Kissinger persuaded Billy of the imminence, the potential imminence of nuclear catastrophe. And I don't know if you all remember, the movie, was it in 1982 or something like that? It was called The Day After. It was a horribly frightening movie of what would happen if hydrogen bombs were actually dropped on our cities and their cities. We don't talk about that much anymore. I think we ought to be aware of that kind of danger. But in the late 70s, early 80s, that was a real threat. And remember, Ronald Reagan called that mutually assured destruction. Kissinger persuaded Billy of this, and so over enormous opposition, including opposition from his wife, she was more conservative, he elected to go to a disarmament conference in Moscow. And there, this is a line you heard me use, but I'll use it again because I think it's so great. The key line in his talk in Moscow was, the United States and the Soviet Union are like two little boys standing in a bathtub filled with gasoline, playing with matches. That's a powerful image, isn't it? He said, we are on the verge of destroying civilization, and that is not what God wants. He got criticized from, evangelicals would say, well, isn't it the case that, the God's in charge of the world and the environment and all that? And he said, yeah, God is in charge, but in the meantime, we have a responsibility to care for this creation, and we do not do it by dropping nuclear bombs on each other. Later, he expanded that to call for disarmament in general. Disarmament, I said, why can't we just disarm? Why do we have to have? And then even later on, as I told you a couple of weeks ago, he would talk about, why do we have to go around the world policing each other? Why does the United States have to police other countries? So he made a dramatic change in his ideas. Now, what is the change from? In the 1950s, he was a spread-eagled, militant, anti-communist. And you listen to the sermons, his early sermons, I don't know if they're more about the gospel or about communism. But for him, they're all the same. Communism was anti-gospel. You got to get rid of communism if we're going to have the gospel. I mean, ferocious attacks on communism. And one thing I'll say there, though, he was not unusual. You go back and you look at American figures, the White House, and the top politicians, presidents in the United States, secretaries of state, of course, secretaries of defense, senators. He wasn't unusual in this respect. But anyway, he was terrified of the communist threat, and by the late 70s, he had changed. There's one other way he changed, and that's the last thing I will say about it. Next to the last thing I will say, and that is, in the last third of his career, the majority of his crusades are overseas. And basically, he came to say, I spent 40 years preaching the gospel here in the U.S. and Canada. You all have heard it. Now, I'm being called to go to India, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, Africa. Some places he was more welcome than others, to say at least. Latin America, he was not welcome at all. I'd say surprisingly, in Africa, he was very welcome. Australia, they loved him. New Zealand, they hated him. The only place where he was pelted with apples, rotten eggs, all this, was in New Zealand. Now, that's a whole other story. The difference between the Australians and New Zealanders, okay. So, I mean, there were different responses. After the crucial event in Moscow in 82, he had successful crusades in Moscow. He even took the gospel into China 3 times, twice into North Korea. Those were not crusades, those were say, fairly private meetings, but at least he went into North Korea, all right? So he felt that he was called overseas, and that if anybody writes a book again, there'll be a lot of books. But I'd say the next most important book about Billy Graham will be the story of Billy Graham overseas, and that's one we just don't know much about. Last thing I want to say is this. When Billy had his final crusade in New York City, where he started off really in some ways, final crusade was in Flushing Meadows in New York City in 2005. And by then, he was, I think, 88, 89, about that. And he had to be helped to the podium. And he was not the king, he had a walker. He had to help him up. And actually, he couldn't stand. He sat at a podium. He had high chairs, so he had to sit, And his voice is very feeble. But basically, it was the same message. There wasn't. I mean, it was the message of come to Christ, come to faith in Christ, and change your life. What I think as a historian is very, very significant about that final meeting is that his final sermon was simultaneously translated into 27 languages. Now, as it happens, Flushing Meadows is in one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the United States. And I am told that, a little research on this, that public schools in Flushing Meadows are prepared to teach English to over 100 different languages. And there's a whole other story why that should be so ethnically diverse, but it was, and that they had a sense that they needed 27 translators, as there is in the United Nations, while he was preaching. So I think this is, symptomatic of how he changed. I should say this before I stop and I want to take some questions, is that Billy did not speak for everyone. He had a lot of critics, as I told you, some death threats. But the main point, I think, is that to the end of his life, he did not speak for a proportional percentage of blacks. There were more blacks in his crusades than he got credit for, but nonetheless, the audience was disproportionately white. Not only was it disproportionately white, but it was disproportionately mainstream white. Now, how do I calculate that? I spent a lot of time examining the letters and how they were signed. And my grandmother came from Ukraine. Her name was Natalia. And the letters that came to Billy, there are no Natalias. Jane, Alice, Kathy, but there are no Natalias. There are no Jamals. And there are no, Steinmetzes. I mean, he did not reach out of the mainstream white ethnographic community. He did not do very well in big cities. And I could go on and indicate places where he did not do so well. The people he did speak to were let's put it this way. The typical person who came to a Graham meeting and who sent money, the typical person who did that was female, under the age of 30, married with children, with a high school education, and had a service job, such as working in the post office, delivering mail, working in, restaurants, the kinds of jobs that we all absolutely crucial to keep the economy going, but they were service jobs. They were not highly skilled jobs. And I'm not the only one, sociologists have worked on these folks, but I have, this is the typical person that heard Graham and whose message resonated. And, no matter who the preacher is, there's going to be a typical slice. There's a typical slice in this church. Every church, there's a typical slice. When you put everybody together, but I'm just trying to say, those were, that was the profile of his main supporters and his main givers. And these are the people who took the $5 bill in an envelope and sent it in. And that's where his support came, mom and pops, literally mom and pops. And very often, I think I mentioned this earlier, he had plenty of fat cats who were willing to give him big money, and he turned it down. That's the money. What I want is support from moms and pops and the $5 bills. Now, he did very well that way, but that was the level that he wanted to appeal to. So that's about all I have to say, and we got a few minutes here to talk. We talk about his life, his character, his legacy. I think he was a towering figure. I spent 10 years of my life with him, and I don't regret it. It was a good way to spend 10 years studying someone. I wish I had spent 10 years working on Taylor Swift.
Make some money on that.
Yeah.
The next 10 years.
Yeah, the next
Yeah.
year. Yeah. What do you think, Mark?
Well,
Yeah.
why do you think that the South American Catholic community rejected him?
Great question. That's great. And it's especially interesting because he worked very hard to have good relations with Catholics, and they worked hard to have good relations with him. That was one of the groups he got along with, strikingly well, okay? And with the Pope too. I mean, and he had 3 meetings with the Pope, and I think I mentioned this. The Pope said afterwards, and Billy and I are brothers, okay? So it wasn't that there was anti-Catholic bias on his part. What I think is that he represented the hostility of American Protestants toward Catholics and Catholic hostility toward Protestants, which was still very alive in the 1960s. I grew up in Missouri. I grew up in Missouri in the 1950s and 60s. I'll speak for myself, being taught that there might be some Catholics in heaven. It's possible that there could be a Catholic or two here and there. That's how I grew up. And I see you nodding.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I was raised Baptist, and this young lady married a Catholic, and you would have thought it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
They're still married today.
Yeah.
They're
Oh, yeah.
successful people, happy people.
Oh, absolutely. And,
I was raised Catholic,
can you raise that way?
and my mother hated Billy Graham.
Mhm.
We could not listen to him in the house.
Yeah, well, and it can't be because of his personal relationships with Catholic bishops and the Pope, but it's what he represented.
Mhm.
He represented this intractable hostility. And I used to tell my students, I do, that I said, you can't imagine the degree of hostility between Protestants and Catholics through the 1970s, and they can't. They can't imagine. They say, what? I say, there's, maybe atheists or, they could maybe see that, but Catholics, they just can't imagine, but boy, was that big. And I think that's why, is that he represented something to them that where he wasn't, personally. And there was also, it was partly political, because until about the 70s, he was swayed by communists, and there's communist agitation. I don't think South America is communist, but there's agitation, so I think that's part of it. Good question. Yeah.
Martin Luther King, you said they had a private meshing.
It was a testing relationship privately. And Billy claimed that King invited him to call him Mike which only his closest friends. There's no evidence from King. That's only Billy saying that. King never said that. And there were a couple times that they met afterwards, and they were publicly cordial. But it was just, no, there was no love lost personally. I think, I cannot document this, I'm certain it was because Graham knew about the immoralities in King's private life. He knew about King's adulteries. And the reason he knew about it is because Billy was close to J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover was called a wire tapping, King's bedrooms. So Hoover knew about it. And Hoover and Billy were friends, and I am 100% certain that that's where that communication. And for Billy Graham, this was a deal breaker. A man who not only not faithful, but who was flagrantly not faithful, okay? And what I think, King's views probably was that Billy had a very short-sighted notion of what the gospel was about. And I'll give you an example. This is in King's defense, certainly. In 1958, Billy had a crusade in San Antonio, and he asked Price Daniel to greet the crusade. Now, who is Price Daniel? Price Daniel was the governor of Texas at that time. And Price Daniel was a public, strong supporter of segregation. Public, strong opponent of Roe Wade. Not Roe Wade, the ground for support of education. He was like George Wallace, okay? And Billy invited Price Daniel to open the crusade in 1958. And Martin Luther King wrote to Billy. He might have phoned him, I don't know that for sure, but he certainly wrote him and implored him not to do this. He said, this will send all the wrong signals. And, and Billy wrote back and he said, I asked the governor of every state that I go in to offer the opening prayer. And so this is just routine. It was a staggeringly stupid thing for Billy Graham to do under the circumstances. I don't think there's any way you can justify that. And King took great offense, and he should have. Why Graham would have done that, why he could not have seen. And now his hench people then said, well, Graham has made very clear where he stands on civil rights. And it's true, he had. But you do something like this. So anyway, it works both ways. Graham knew about King's adulteries. MLK knew that Graham, had memories. And so I think, just think what would have happened if those two guys could have really worked together. What we would have gained. And I think it's one of the great tragedies of modern American church history. That they couldn't overlook, their differences to try to. Didn't happen. Now, I will say for Billy is that he did bring in black evangelists and on his team. And what is often overlooked is how they featured black artists, especially Mahalia Jackson. She was crucial. She sang for him, but she sang for Martin Luther King too. Now there is a wonderful person to study, Mahalia Jackson. She wouldn't be part of this. But anyway, so Mahalia Jackson and Leontine Price.
Ethel Waters.
Sorry?
Ethel Waters.
Waters, yeah. There are others that names are not coming to me, but there are others. Do you remember when we did the music, the hymns, and the singer of Amazing Grace, Winton, I lost his name, but Winton Fix. He's one of the Gators, but he worked with Billy Graham too. So he featured black artists and then Latino artists and Latino music, and then he got into youth music. And he said, I know nothing about this, I want nothing to do with it, but I do love those people. So, yeah, thanks, John. That's a good point. Anything else you, yeah.
One of the things that was striking when I read your book was the preparation that Billy took as he was planning these crusades, like a year in advance. And that he worked with the local clergy of all different denominations that were a part of that effort. And, that really speaks a lot to his open-mindedness and willing to work with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the New York Crusade, his advanced men, now they're always men, he never got the memo on women. That's a whole other story. And actually, Anna invited me to offer some classes or discussions on women in American Christianity. And that's one of the things I will talk about is the white men, white and black, who never got the memo, and Billy was among them. But anyway, they were always advanced men who went into locales, and in New York up to it was 2 years where they started prayer meetings, neighborhood prayer meetings, and where, again, Graham was astute, is that his advanced men would arrange for him to have numerous interviews with the local news broadcasters. So he became a fixture on local TV months, weeks ahead of the meeting. And just one example there, in New York City, the big Protestant mainline theologian was Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr took great offense at the Billy Graham, on TV, sort of whipping up the crowd kind of thing. And Niebuhr said this in Life magazine, he said, "We dread the prospect of," and he said, "a very sincere young man, but he makes salvation altogether too easy." Well, I have other views on Reinhold Niebuhr, but anyway, that's another story. So Chuck is absolutely right. People came in and they worked very hard for a year in advance. What often is not recognized is that Graham also insisted that they stay on afterwards for up to 3 months to follow up with the converts and to go to them and say, "How are you doing? How is your Christian walk going?" And they would usually try to send converts back to evangelical churches if the convert did not, well, he called them inquirers, not inquirers. If the inquirer did not have a church, he would send them to a local evangelical church, usually Baptist, okay? But if they did have a church, he would send them back to that church, whatever it was, including Catholic. And he got a lot, if I may say, a lot of crap for sending them back. And I mean, the words that are in the letters of those days, papists, Romanists, all these. Our son-in-law is Catholic, so I totally had a great time talking about all this, but I mean, the language. But he'd send them back to the Catholic Church, and very controversially, Jews would send them back to synagogue. Not that he wanted them not to embrace Christ, but rather, it's a whole lot better to be a faithful, practicing Jew than to have no faith at all. So, they would stay on. And I think that's a real mark. Because by then, there's no splash for him. He's gone. But, you're still going knocking on doors. How are you doing? That's a great point, Jeff. Thank you for, bringing that up.
This whole subject about the segregation and everything is so interesting, because we've all got a different sort of point of view depending on where we grew up and how things went down and everything. And just,
How about you?
well, I was just gonna say, in Indiana, you didn't have legal segregation, right? But we had plenty of segregation, which was enforced by the real estate,
Yeah.
Black people could only buy houses in certain neighborhoods and they'd get rejected trying to buy something in the suburbs or whatever. And in my case, I didn't have any black friends until high school. And what they did to kind of help solve the problem was they built a giant fancy new high school in the north side of town.
Well, that's Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, and North Central High School. still the biggest, fanciest high school they have, it's like a college campus now. And 1/3 of the students came from the black, neighborhood, black part of Indianapolis. So when I got to high school, all of a sudden I had a lot of black friends. They're in the choir with me, they're playing football with me, boom, boom, boom. And so for us at that point, and it's pretty good because you're only 15, 16 years old.
Yeah.
What the heck is segregation? I never heard. These are good friends of mine,
Yeah.
So in our case, I thought we were lucky. But thinking back on what you're talking about today, we had a major source of segregation back then. You know what it was? Catholic schools. I probably didn't have any Catholic friends in high school because they were all going to the two big Catholic schools that were close by there. Now I think about that, that's weird. That just doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it was.
I went, this is so exciting. How many hours do we have?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, where we all grew up. I mean, you're exactly right. And Kathy and I grew up in southwest Missouri, and the town we grew up in was 2% black, and right now it's probably 1%. In Springfield, Missouri. I mean, just, yeah. And there was a black high school in town, and it was integrated in the year before we went to high school, socially, not at all. And so where we grew up. But to go to this question, just quickly, Catholics and Protestants, yeah, because of schooling, they are, they're held apart. Another group that held apart from mainline evangelicals and Pentecostals. Pentecostals, now, again, my students, they don't understand. Of course, Pentecostals are everywhere, right? In those days, Pentecostals were the unwashed on the other side of the tracks. They were the people who allegedly handled snakes. And so we grew up in, we did not handle snakes. We were afraid of snakes as anyone else. But I mean, this was the imagery. These are the crazy people out there with snakes.
Well, I went to Tennessee and they did have us.
Yeah, well, you had to go, not to our church anyway. Yeah, to this day, there are places in Kentucky that handle snakes, yeah.
West
There's
Virginia
some in the
too.
North Carolina mountains.
Are there really? Even now, yeah. And when in the former life, I worked on Pentecostals, and it's amazing how often, this is what reporters probably know about. They call you up and they say, can I talk about Pentecostalism? And they say, well, what's this thing about snake handling? I say, well, it's about 1/100th of 1% of them, but, that's what they. Hey, guys, thank you. This has been wonderful. I especially want to thank John for, being so patient.
There's a big Pentecostal church on Route 42 in Windows. Oh, yeah, great, they were so neat.
Yeah.